everyone, so today we're back with another bread. We're making challah bread today, which is a very old style bread. It's been around for thousands of years. I used to make this one a lot at the restaurant that I worked with. We would make it every week for our weekend French toast for our brunch menu. It's really good if you make a honey cream cheese spread for it. All you would do is throw cream cheese in a mixer or on your KitchenAid with a little bit of honey to add some flavor to it, and then spread that on there once it's baked, and it's the best. But we're going to get right into baking the bread, and you'll see some common themes like the focaccia from last week. A lot of bread baking is similar in that the process is the same, but the ingredients differ based on which bread you're making. So we're going to add our flour first. And one thing I wanted to note last week when we first started our bread week about the flour is that the reason you'll see a lot of bread recipes that have, for example, this one says 2 to 3 cups of flour. The reason it has that variable in there is that your flour can actually change based on the weather conditions that it was grown in. So there are things that the farmers can't control. They try really hard to get a consistent grain product out to the manufacturers, but they can't control how much water, like rainwater, or how much sun their flour gets, or their grain gets, and that actually affects the final product. So if your grain grew in a place or a time period where it was just really rainy and the farmer had no control over that, then obviously your flour is going to be holding a little bit more moisture already from the get-go. So that's why there is that variable. So if you have a flour that is wetter, then you're going to have to add more flour to the final product as you go along. If you have a flour that grew in a drier environment, you're not going to have to add as much flour. So you always want to start with the lower amount. So you would start with the 2 cups and then move up to the 3 cups. And you might even have to go beyond that 3 cups. That's just the variable that the original recipe writer found when they were making the bread. So that's one thing to keep in mind with bread baking, is that there is that variable. Don't let it scare you though, because a lot of it is just getting to know your dough. So if you've made this bread several times, you'll know what it's supposed to look like. You'll know what it's supposed to feel like. And I try to be good about showing you that and teaching you different methods to make sure that your bread is ready to go. So don't let that scare you. Just let it be in the back of your mind so that if you're making bread and you're like, oh man, I've made this recipe 15 times and it's never done this. Why is it so much wetter this time? That's probably why. You got a batch of flour that was, rained on a lot. So there you go. So we have our flour in here, and we're going to add our yeast. And remember, for the blog portion, I like to use the active dry yeasts that you see how to get it started with the water and the sugar. But for the blog, I like to use the instant yeast, which you would get. It usually says bread machine on it because it's the kind you just throw into a bread machine and you don't do anything to it beforehand. So that way you kind of see how to do each bread with both types, because I don't know what type you might be able to get at your store. Some days one's out of stock and you're stuck with the other, and I don't want you to be like, oh man, I've never used this. How do I use this one? But if you watch this blog, or if you watch the video and you read my blog, you'll know how to use both. So we're going to use the instant yeast, and then our salt. And remember, I like to put them on opposite sides of bowls just so that they don't touch, so that your yeast and your salt don't start to react before we get everything in the bowl. So this bread is actually a little bit different from the focaccia bread that we made last week. Last week was 3 ingredients. It was flour, salt, yeast, and then a little bit of sugar if you use the active dry. And it had olive oil in it as well. But this one's a little bit different in that we are going to add eggs and egg yolks to it, as well as the butter. So that makes this an enriched bread dough. So enriched bread dough just means that you have that extra addition of fat to it. So, and then another ingredient that this one has that the focaccia didn't have is honey. And not every challah recipe that you'll see has honey in it. The one that I was given at school did not have honey in it. The one we used at the restaurant did have honey in it, and it was a really good challah bread. So I tried to find something that mirrored that one, because even though I made it a million times and had it memorized at one point, I don't have it memorized anymore. So I found one that most closely resembled the one that I was used to making every single week because it's just a little bit more familiar to me. So there's all of our ingredients. We're going to stick it on our mixer with the dough hook, and I'm going to let it go until it is ready. And if I have to add more flour, I'll let you know, and I'll show you that process. But we're going to let it go until it's ready, and then we're going to let it rest. And then when it's done resting, we're going to braid it and then throw it into the oven, and it's going to be delicious. So, alright, so my challah bread has been going for a minute or two, and as you can see, it's very, very soupy right now. So I'm going to add half a cup of flour and let it go and see if that works out better. If not, I'll add more, and then at the end, I'll let you know how much I had to add to get to where we need it to be. So that's that. Okay, so our dough is all ready. It's a stickier dough than you'll remember the focaccia being last week. Once we get past this next step, I'll show you that. But we can do the window pane test and see that it is all nice and gluten-y like it's supposed to be. Because you might see that it's a little bit of a looser dough, a little stickier dough than the one last week and think, oh, this isn't right. So you can always do this and make sure that it's mixed completely. And as you can see, it's not cooperating. Let's try that again. It's sticking to my fingers. That's how sticky it is. So you'll want to make sure your fingers are nice and floury. And as you can see, you can pull it and you can start seeing daylight before it rips. So that's exactly where you want it to be. And notice how sticky it was. It wasn't cooperating at first. But the other thing I did is, this is a cinnamon raisin challah. I didn't, in my short research, see a whole bunch of these, so I kind of just made it up as I went with what looked like I remember it looking from the restaurant, because again, I don't have that recipe memorized anymore. But I just added the cinnamon and raisins to this, and we're going to mix this all together. I don't let it mix for too much because I want it to have a nice cinnamon swirl. I don't want it to be fully cinnamon. If you wanted it to be fully cinnamon, you could let it go. You could even probably add the cinnamon sooner. The raisins you definitely wouldn't want to add until this point because you want to make sure that your gluten is nice and built up before you add the raisins. We kind of mentioned that when we did the rum baba, because if you add your raisins too soon, it's harder for your gluten to develop. So it's better to add them after your gluten's developed so that it's not preventing that structure from being formed. So we're going to mix this up until it's all looks nice and yummy, and then I'll show you how sticky the dough is, and then we're going to let it rest until it's ready to be formed, and then we'll shape it up. Okay, so here's our dough. As you can see, we have a lovely cinnamon swirl. There are definitely parts of it that are still white. That's what I usually look for. And I'm just going to transfer it into another bowl so that I can use this bowl for something else. But you can see how it's definitely doughy, but it's also really sticky. So that's what we're looking for. If you touch it, it'll probably stick to your fingers, but you want it to make sure that it has that nice gluten structure. So doing the window pane test to make sure you can see the sunlight through it is definitely important, because you don't want to think it's not done because it's wet. So make sure that it's done and then leave it alone. So another thing is, a lot of recipes, when they transfer it to a bowl to let it rest, say to spray it. I generally forego the spraying. I don't like to add pan spray to anything that I don't have to. And I found that with this, as long as you have a nice spatula or even a nice bowl scraper, these are really cheap on Amazon. This is my best friend. Then it's really easy to get your dough out without having to spray it. So that's always an option if you'd like to forego the pan spray as well. So I'm just going to cover this guy up with a towel, let it rest, and then once it's doubled in size, we can move on to the next step. Welcome back! So our challah is now doubled in size. This is a really big bowl, so it might not look like it, but it has. So we're just going to take it out, and we're going to start preparing for our 8-strand plait. So first thing we're going to do is, it is a little bit sticky, so I'm going to add a little bit of flour to the top. And then I'm going to flip it over. Make sure you can see this. just add just like a pinch of flour to the other side, just so that it's not quite so sticky. And then the first thing you want to make sure is that each piece in your braid is going to be the same exact size. Because if you end up with some that are this big and then some that are this big, it's not going to braid correctly. And then the other thing that you want to make sure is that if you end up with them all the same length, that they're also the same width around, because you don't want to have some that are this big around and then some that are this big around, because it's just also not going to look as nice. So you want to kind of make sure that you are making them all the same size. So theoretically, if you follow the recipe to the exact T, you should be able to get 8 strands that are about 4 ounces each. So you can do the super OCD Amanda way and actually weigh them all out and make sure they're 4 ounces a piece. Or you can do this more guesstimation way that I'm going to show you. So the first thing is, anytime you're making bread, you don't want to cut it, you don't want to just rip it, because you spent all that time making the nice gluten structure to rip it apart and just ruin it. So you want to make sure that you use something like that's going to cut right through it so that it's not damaging that structure at all. You're just separating pieces from each other. So I like to use this. It's called a bench scraper or a bench knife. You can get it on Amazon for maybe like $6. Challah also has them, so you can get it from there if you have one of those stores near you, or you can find it online, probably Williams & Sonoma or Challah. But this is really handy. It's also really nice to clean up any flour when you're done, so you can just scrape it all into a pile and push it right into your trash can. So it's also nifty for cleanup. But you can also use a knife, or if you have something that's like hard plastic like this will actually cut through it as well. So you just want to use something so that you're not ripping the dough apart, because you don't want to do that. So you just want to make sure that your dough is kind of even sized, so that you just you cut it down the middle, and then you cut each half in half. Make sure that it's about the same size on each side. And then you would cut each half in half again. And then theoretically, if everything was about the same size when you started, then they should be about 4 ounces. So I will go through and I will, if my scale wants to cooperate, look and see and make sure that's about 4 ounces. If one is like a lot bigger than the others, then I will take from that one and add to something that's maybe not as big. But this looks like these are all about relatively the same size. So I think we're good to go. Yep. So the next step is that we're going to make our strands. So we need to make 8 strands out of our 8 pieces of bread. And there is a specific way that you want to do this. So to make sure that you are actually seeing this, I am going to adjust some things so that you can see it from an upward angle and you can see exactly how we're doing, what we're doing, so that your braid can be beautiful and impressive and all your friends will love you forever. So we're going to do that. Okay, so I wanted to show you how to roll out the last 2 pieces. So it's a little bit different from what you would think. I'm going to flatten out my piece a little bit, and I'm going to take the top and fold it down into the middle, kind of flatten it out again, and then take the top and fold it down and connect to the bottom, and then I'm going to roll it. As you can see, it's still a little bit sticky. You're going to use that to your advantage, because by it sticking, as you move it, it kind of helps to slide it. And so notice I'm not stretching it and pulling it. I'm actually just kind of pushing it and pulling it back and forth with this part of my hand. If you were to like actually stretch it and pull it too much, the raisins in it will actually tear the bread itself. And like we said earlier, you've spent so much time building up that gluten structure, you don't want to just rip it apart and destroy it. So this is actually very little work. It's kind of just a moving back and forth. If it is too sticky and it does start sticking too much to your counter, you can add just a pinch of flour so it's not quite so sticky. But you don't want it to be so much that it's not doing what it's supposed to be doing when you roll it. So as you can see, this is about a little bit longer than 12 inches, and they're all about the same length. We're going to put them all next to each other. And I'm going to try and braid this upside down so that you can see how it should be braided. So you start with them all so that they're kind of connected at the top here. And then the important thing to remember, anytime you braid your bread, whether you're doing this 8-strand braid or if you were doing a 6-strand braid or any other number of strands, your process is the same, and that this side you would go right from left, or I'm sorry, left from right, and like you would when you read, and it would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And anytime you move it, so say we move this one over here, you would still have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It would still start from left to right and 1 to 8. So that's the first thing to remember. So our first step is going to be to take number 8 and put it under number 7 and then over number 1. So we're going to lay the 7 down there, and we're going to move this guy all the way over here. So now, like I said, once you move something, you restart your counting from left to right. So this is now 1 and this is now 8. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Our next step is going to be take 8 and move it to over top of number 5. So find 5. You 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we'll put it over number 5. And if they start sticking too much, you can just sprinkle a little bit of flour on it. So now this guy is number 5. Our third step is going to be to take number 2, put it under number 3, and then over number 8. So this next step is kind of where I got stuck the first time I did this 8-strand plait, because it seems a little bit weird, and at first you scratch your head and you're like, is this really right? But you're going to take number 4 and you're going to put it over top of, or I'm sorry, take number 1 and put it over top of number 4. So we have 1 here and then 4 there. So then it's kind of like, well, didn't we just reverse what we did? Kind of, but not really. So just go with it and trust that it's the correct way to do it. Because I kind of scratched my head at first and I was like, okay, well, this will either work or it won't. And it ended up working out. So the last step before we repeat everything is to take number 7, go under number 6, and then over number 1. So take it all the way to the end. And then you're going to repeat your process. I think when I made it the first time, I repeated it so that I was able to do it 3 times. I might go back and try and clean this up a little bit. If your pieces are too sticky, they'll do this thing where they kind of melt together, and you don't want it to do that, but it might be too late. So try to make sure your pieces aren't too sticky. So then you're just going to start the process over. So you're going to take number 8, put it under number 7, and then over number 1. And then you're going to take 8 and put it over 5. And then take 2 and put it under 3 and over 8. And then take 1 and put it over 4. And then lastly take 7 and put it under 6 and over 1. So as you can see, we don't really have room to braid anymore on this side. I might go back over here. So there's this mantra I learned in pastry school, and it's never proceed with a bad product. So do it right the first time, and then you don't have to go back and try and fix it. Okay. So then what I like to do is take the ends where it's kind of not so nice looking and kind of pinch it off and roll it, and then tuck that under. And then you can move this whole braid and put it on your sheet pan, and then let it rise a second time. I'm putting it on parchment with a little bit of flour sprinkled down. You can do parchment sprayed with spray, but I prefer to use flour. And then we're going to let it rise a second time, like I said. But another important thing to note when you're braiding is that we kind of braided it loosely. If you braid it too tightly and you were to like really braid it like you're braiding hair so tightly that it won't rise as nicely. So try and do a looser braid like we did, and we'll come back and look at this guy once it's ready to go into the oven. Okay, so our bread is doubled in size. I just wanted to show you real quick how to check it to make sure that it's ready to go into the oven, because you want it to be fully proofed so that it doesn't come out less or more dense. So what you're going to do is you just want to get a little bit of flour on your finger and gently poke it. And if it keeps that indent, like see it kind of kept that indent there. If it keeps that indent, then that's what you want. If it pops right back out, then you give it a few more minutes. And then you actually want to take this guy and you want to egg wash it. So I just have a little bit of egg. I just took a whole egg and kind of scrambled it in this little guy, or like mixed it in this little guy, and then you'll just brush it on there. I already did that. You can see how shiny it is. Different pastry chefs do different ratios. In school we learned just to take whatever, like if you're separating yolks from your whites and you accidentally got yolk in it, to just throw it out and use it as your egg wash. Some people mix a little bit of milk in it, some people mix heavy cream in it, some people just do straight yolks. I usually just crack an egg, but you can play around with it if you want to see if there's a way that you find that you like better. So we're going to throw this guy in the oven. I have it set to 400 degrees. We're going to let it bake until it's nice and brown on top, and it'll sound hollow if you turn it over and tap the underside of it. So we're going to let it do its thing in the oven. Alright everybody, our challah is out of the oven. You can see it's a nice dark brown color. That's kind of what you're looking for. You can also, if you're not sure if it's ready yet, you can turn it on the underside and kind of give it a tap. And if it sounds hollow, then you're good to go. But there's our challah. Super delicious for breakfast. I like to toast it with butter and cinnamon sugar. And you, like I said earlier in the video, you could do a honey cream cheese and spread that on there, and that's really good too. So enjoy.